So, no Second Prances. Well, depending on who you talk to, it's either OMG, best episode of all time ever, or hate, season 6 sucks, pandering, out of character, bleh. We have only so much middle ground. Now, personally, I'm a lot closer to the former camp. I mean, I wouldn't call it my favorite episode of all time or anything, but it was nothing short of excellent, and easily my top pick of season 6 so far. The intent of the episode, as I see it, is to get us to really start sympathizing with Starlight, which is crucial for the character at this point. Ever since her reformation was sealed at the end of Season 5, the fandom has been quick to draw the comparison between Starlight and Sunset Shimmer from the Equestria Girls films, and for rather obvious reasons, both being reformed villains who have gone on to be something of additions to the main six. In Sunset's case, it was the sympathy built for her across Rainbow Rocks which catapulted her from severely underwritten and easily forgotten movie villain to choice brony waifu. With Starlight, the writers were doubtless going to want to try a similar approach, and already similar tricks are being used. Starlight might, as a likely defense mechanism, make jokes about her past to her friends, while Sunset wanted anything but to be reminded of it, but in both cases, they're written in a way to capture their regret and desire to make progress in improving themselves and distance themselves from the terrible things that they did. Of course, it's a little more difficult for Starlight for a couple of reasons. For one, Starlight was a considerably more effective villain. I don't think many people cared for Sunset as a villain at all, but Starlight legitimately disturbed and infuriated people. It was relatively easy to accept a nice Sunset because Sunset the villain didn't leave much of an impression. Starlight's villainy was a lot more real, which makes it something harder to overlook. And well, if we're going to accept her, it's something that cannot simply be glossed over. One complaint I saw for the Crystalline was that Starlight there was jarring. For a lot of people, she was suddenly too nice that it didn't even feel like the same character anymore. This episode, though, I think it did a lot to ease that feeling by making it feel more like she still has a lot of work to do. We see that she's genuinely sorry for her past actions, but she's still a pony whose first instinct is to exert her will over others and use magic to her immediate benefit. And in doing so, and showing us how she is still struggling to do the right thing, even if it isn't yet natural to her, it helps to make her feel like the same character we were first introduced to, while also getting us to start rooting for her in hopes of seeing her truly overcome it all. The other thing that makes redemption slightly more difficult for Starlight as opposed to Sunset is the fact that we were robbed of an opportunity for external conflict when it comes to getting past what she did. Some of the scenes in Rainbow Rocks that were most effective for getting us feeling sorry for Sunset were the ones at the very start, where we see her shunned and rejected by the classmates who she had wronged. I love almost everything about the cutie remark, but one thing I think is a major miscalculation with it is including Starlight's reconciliation with the villagers in the song montage at the very end. Surely this should have been saved for its own episode. As it is, we lost out on a valuable chance to see her interact with the ponies whose lives she had actually affected. Also, it just makes it seem too easy. The damage might be done there, but I was impressed to see this episode still find a way to capture a similar effect, at least to an extent. Because it wasn't a secluded village that Trixie hurt, but rather Ponyville itself. We can still see ponies judging Trixie for what she did, and in having Starlight relate to that, our sympathies extend from Trixie to her as well. Who knows if the fears she expresses here are actually justified, if what she did is out there in the news for the average pony in Ponyville to discover. It certainly doesn't seem like it. No one really looks at her funny or anything. Well, not until she gives them reason to, at least. It doesn't matter, though. The fact that she has worries about it is enough to make us feel. Pairing Starlight with Trixie was actually just a brilliant call, period. She may be most frequently compared to Sunset, but the parallel with the great and powerful one is so strong I'm surprised I had never considered it before this episode came around. Trixie and Starlight both appeared in an episode where they inadvertently had the life they knew upheaved. Then they came back several episodes later seeking revenge, and by the same means, making Twilight Sparkle miserable. So, it's a very natural combination. Certain circumstances are different, such as the worst of Trixie not coming until she was under the influence of magic, while Starlight has no such excuse, but the experience is the same. They can relate in powerful ways and are just good for each other. In seeing them open up to one another so genuinely, sympathy is successfully earned. The episode also seeks to get us on Starlight's side by pitting her against a Twilight very much in the wrong. This is one of the more controversial aspects of it all. A lot of people have said that Twilight is out of character here. Personally, I don't see it. Think about it from her perspective. The point of the dinner is for Twilight to show how great she is doing as a teacher to Princess Celestia. And as the show has made clear many times now, when Celestia is involved, Twilight isn't going to be thinking with the clearest head. I'm reminded especially of that scene in A Bird in the Hoof. With Celestia there, the negative traits of all of her friends, things she'd normally be a lot more accepting of, pop out to Twilight in a much bigger way. The way I see it, the silverware placement jokes in the episode exist for a reason beyond simply LOL OCD. They illustrate that Twilight is really micromanaging things on an extreme level to see that this dinner goes well. She might not show the stress as visibly as with her more remembered freakouts, but it is clearly important to her to see that this is a success. And yeah, I can definitely buy that while she may have left off with Trixie on what seemed like decent terms at the end of Magic Duel, that isn't going to necessarily mean that Trixie is the pony she wants to present to Princess Celestia as the friend that her pupil has made. Especially given that, as What About Discord proved last season, Twilight isn't actually the best at forgiving and forgetting. Her behavior is wrong, and it's understandable that people would be off-put by it, but it's not the fault of the writing. She is simply letting her priorities become skewed and thus making a mistake, and ultimately it is her who learns that she is wrong in the end. And I kind of appreciate that. Really, since becoming a princess, we've seen Twilight's flaws rounded out to the point where a lot of people think she's become a bit boring. You'd think that they'd actually be grateful for a reminder that Miss Alicorn isn't infallible. Honestly, I think the people complaining about Fluttershy being out of character in the episode for being scared of the Manticore are actually of the stronger case. I can sort of understand why it was done, to show that the Manticore was mean and hungry and not so friendly as the last, but it does just seem kind of weird when taming a Manticore is literally the first memorable thing we see Flutters do in the entire series. Then again, Trixie does introduce it specifically as a pony-eating Manticore, and if we think back, could eat a pony in one bite was on that list of adjectives regarding the dragons she so feared. Perhaps Fluttershy is just really afraid of beasts which might actually eat her. Not an unreasonable fear, if you ask me. Speaking of being eaten by a Manticore, let's move on to the other much talked about topic of this episode. Is Trixie suicidal? My first instinct was to dismiss this thought entirely. I follow Nick Confalone, the writer for the episode, on Twitter, and to me he comes across as just a really jovial guy who doesn't take things very seriously, and that's reflected in his episodes, even if I suppose Hearthbreakers did have a rather strong emotional core. He really isn't someone who I would expect to intentionally write an episode touching on suicide of all things. I do kind of wonder if instead what Trixie does is intended as something of a trust exercise. If that is the case, though, yeah, it doesn't really come across. Trixie isn't written as someone who still has faith. She's written as someone defeated and in something of a stupor. And with everything we do know about her character, it's easy to see why Trixie might be in a rather dark place. The big revelation of the episode is that Trixie doesn't have any other friends. In fact, from her use of the phrase first friend to describe Starlight, we can perhaps conclude that she's never had any friends. That makes me wonder. In Ghostbusters, she had her act where the point seemed to be presenting herself as the best there is, a heroine to be adored, with the adulation of the crowds being her reward. Could perhaps the sense of fulfillment attained there be what she relied on in lieu of actually letting ponies get close to her? To have it ripped from her then, for her reputation to be shattered and her left with nothing, suddenly her desperation in Magic Duel makes a lot more sense. The episode even confirms something in regards to her motivation there. Nothing of what happened in Ghostbusters was really Twilight's fault at all. She may have cleaned up a mess that Trixie couldn't, but that isn't why Trixie was outed as a fraud and her reputation was ruined. No, the fault is really with Trixie herself for claiming she could do things that she couldn't, and, well, Snips and Snails for being idiots. It was Twilight she singled out for her revenge, however, and now we know for sure why. She was jealous of what Twilight could do and wanted nothing more than to outdo her. But the events of Magic Duel just saw her corrupted and made to do things she didn't morally agree with. At the end of it all, what is Trixie left with but an even more tarnished reputation, and deep pangs of guilt for her own actions, as she's left to see the pony she so deeply envies continue to ascend in remarkable ways, even becoming a princess. Alone and bitter, self-loathing just seems like it would be inevitable. And then, in the process of trying to rebuild her reputation, Trixie meets Starlight, a pony who actually understands her, who can relate to her on a deep level. And not only that, but one who seems genuinely impressed by and supportive of her stage magic, willing even to play the part of her assistant. Suddenly Trixie has something she never had before, a bright spot in a life which just hasn't been going her way. To feel like that is then taken from her, and by her own mistake, by her own stubborn, ugly emotions getting in the way, yeah, I can definitely see why that would just accentuate the reality of how miserable she is. I can totally buy that without friendship in her life, Trixie is prepared for the consequences here. And really, I think that is the most incredible feat of this episode. In Ghostbusters, Trixie was a villain of the week foil for Twilight, there just to receive her comeuppance. In Magic Duel, Larson made her a bit more interesting, as the pony pushed to desperate actions, which she ultimately regretted. This episode, though, it transformed her even more into this deeply sympathetic character who I feel invested in and really want to see find some happiness. The goal of the episode might have been to win Starlight sympathy, but for me, I think it might have won Trixie even more. Seriously, this catapulted Trixie like 10 places up my list of ponies, and that is a powerful thing. Finally, there's one more aspect to discuss with this episode, and that's the other thing that seems to be earning it some derision within the fandom. Why exactly does Rarity need 3 whole weeks to make a single outfit? I mean, seriously, she had help, but she once completed an entire fashion line in less than a day. And that's not to mention the speed at which she knocked out all those princess dresses. It's completely unreasonable that she wouldn't be able to put something together in time for her friend. To suggest otherwise is simply bad writing. Oh wait, I guess no one is actually talking about that. No, the other hot topic for this episode is not that actual problem, but rather the whole idea of fan pandering. Particularly in regard to the inclusion of Derpy and Vinyl. I really don't get it. Did people expect for these characters to just not show up ever again after Slice of Life? I can still remember when the fandom would get super excited at even just a few seconds of Derpy, but now it's apparently something bad. I know Slice of Life to some is nothing but fan service, but to me, it was actually something of a transformational episode in which Ponyville was effectively changed from simply being a colorful backdrop into a more organic setting. Background elements were reborn as actual characters with personalities and relationships. This is a good thing from a world-building perspective. It helps the world breathe and just feel ultimately more genuine. When I see characters from Slice of Life show up, at this point it's as much if not more of a continuity nod than anything to do with the fandom. Besides, their inclusion here really did work on a humor level anyway. Sometimes it's best to just line up and let ourselves have fun with what we get. Especially given this episode really was wonderfully fun. The whole issue of possible attempted suicide aside, it was simply a good time. Nick Confalone has proven himself to be good with humor, and this episode went big with it. The ending scene with Celestia, the entire idea of Angel Bunny falling hard for Starlight, the scenes with Big Mac and Mrs. Cake, Rainbow Dash making this face. There really was a lot to laugh at and smile about the whole episode through. And that, combined with the wonderful strides it made in developing Starlight and Trixie both, secured this one in my book as an exceedingly impressive episode, enough to make me more optimistic about both Season 6 and Starlight Glimmer's character arc than I was before. After this one, I can't wait to see just where it all goes from here. This has been a RarityDash review. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.